Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and this morning I decided to do this video as a voiceover so that we could have this chart here. But yes, I'm still drinking my morning coffee and everything, and I'm just kind of put it over yesterday's training footage. And I linked this chart because it really shows kind of an interesting spin on things for hypertrophy, and I linked the full thing back on my Facebook fan page and back to the actual researcher who made it. I think it goes all the way back to his original Facebook page, so you guys can kind of see the author of it and everything. And it's an interesting chart because it goes a long way to explain why we see sometimes equal hypertrophy with different protocols when they're looked at in a lab. Because again, we get this whole idea in our head, and a lot of it comes from even people like Dr. Brad talking about total volume, right? And he's equating volume when we talk about hypertrophy as basically total tonnage moved. In other words, reps times sets times weight. So like he did a study and he found that I believe it was something like 7 sets of 3 produced the same amount of muscle growth as 3 sets of 10, or at least in the short term. Now there could have been a small difference, and if one of them produced 1 or 2% more muscle growth, we wouldn't see that in a 6 or 8 week study. You would need to extrapolate that out over like a year in order to see a full 2 or 3% difference in hypertrophy. And again, it would be really hard to find the statistical significance there unless you had something like 1,000 people in each group. But what's interesting here, this goes a long way to explain a lot of that, because, again, we'll use this volume, but then they go do studies on really, really high reps on certain exercises, doing like 20 and 25 rep sets to failure, and they find that 4 sets of that produces about the same muscle growth as 4 sets in around the 10 rep range to failure. And it makes sense because if you're taking sets to failure, you're reaching the upper threshold fibers, and then, obviously you're getting all the quality reps in there. But also keep in mind, guys, taking sets to absolute failure is enormously difficult on your recovery. So that becomes a problem too. But when we look at the chart, what it's effectively showing is that what rep point you start reaching all the muscle fibers. In other words, with any given set, whether you're doing 1 rep, 5 reps, 10 reps, 20 reps, there is a point to where all the various endurance fibers cannot lift the weight anymore. On a heavy set, it's going to be on the very first rep, right? So a 5 rep max or less, it's going to be immediate. Every single rep in that set, whether it's 1 or you go all the way to 5, is actually giving you a training effect in the sense of you are stimulating all the available muscle fibers, right? You're hitting all the fiber types. And the reason that matters is that endurance fibers just don't grow much. So he was talking purely for hypertrophy. And yeah, hypertrophy matters for strength athletes because we know there's an enormous correlation between hypertrophy and strength. It's not the only factor, but it is the biggest one. It is the biggest one, again, once you take certain leverages and stuff out. And what we find, that's why when they look at exercises like the squat, that's more interesting than the deadlift, because the deadlift relies more on leverages. In other words, we see squatters and deadlifters who are within 20 pounds of each other, even at elite level powerlifting, but then you also see guys who are hundreds of pounds apart because they have levers that allow them to deadlift better. Someone like Kaller Willem. He squats in the high 500s, just under 600 pounds, but deadlifts 900 plus, right? Again, freaky leverage differences. So the squat is always an interesting one because leverages seem to matter less. Total muscle mass versus height seems to be the biggest factor in determining your max squat. And there's good data on that with multiple researchers involved in this point. So the point there is that they are correlated. Now, when we look at the chart, that's where it gets interesting, because this can tell you how much work you are doing as far as your actual volume counting, rather than look at tonnage, because at the end of the day, guys, weight is just weight. I mean, your muscles don't know weight. They know tension, they know exhaustion, they know if they're recruiting muscle fibers or not. That's all they really know. Just weight is one of the variables that we can control to, again, get us to a certain threshold of intensity. Well, when you look at this, we can use it to count quality reps. So in other words, if you know what your 1 rep max is, or your 5 rep max, or 10 rep max, or whatever, you can calculate on each set how many quality reps you do based on a chart like this. In other words, it's around 5 total reps from your max. So in other words, if you're using a 5 rep max, every single rep on anywhere between a 1 and a 5 rep set is going to give you some stimulation of hypertrophy. If it's a 10 rep max, only reps 6 through 10 count, right? And This doesn't mean you just do that number of sets, because a lot of people say, okay, well, if I just do 5 sets of 10 with my 10 rep max, well, how are you going to do that? You probably are not lifting your 10 rep max if you can do multiple sets of 10 with it, because what that means is that if you did a 10 rep max, your 10th rep would be a grinder. It would be very, very difficult on your last rep. And if you try to do an 11th rep, let's say on the bench press, the bar would probably stick on your chest and you wouldn't even be able to break it free. So if you were to do a full 10 rep max, you're probably only going to get like 9 reps on your second set. So you really only are going to get 4 quality reps, arguably. Although we could argue at that point, is it becoming your 9 rep max instead? But the point is, no, that's not going to work. You're not going to get 25 reps that way. So what you would probably end up doing is 5 sets of 10 with your 12 rep max. That's probably doable. But you guys see the problem there. You're really only getting 3 reps per set at that point, times 5, so about 15 quality reps. Whereas then if you took your 5 rep max and you did a 3x3, right, you would get about 9 quality reps. And I think this goes to explain why we oftentimes do see just as much hypertrophy with low rep training, because a lot of people argue, no, we don't. Well, yeah, we do. We see plenty of really jacked lifters who don't really even train over 4 or 5 reps. There's a lot of them out there. But obviously we see a lot of guys who do really high reps and they get jacked, but they do a lot of volume. And then people would point out, well, they do a lot more volume, but they're really not. And in other words, if they're only getting on average 3 quality reps that are stimulating growth, because the earlier reps in a high rep set are there just to fatigue you enough to where the final reps start giving you quality reps to where you actually are working hard enough, that's still what they end up with. And you could calculate it out that way. And that's something that you could track yourself. How many reps are you inducing per workout, per week, whatever, that will give you hypertrophy? And that's a good way to look at your total volume also. It's just a different way of looking at it. Instead of doing it by weight on the bar times sets times reps, you could just count quality reps. In other words, you could know that you did 35 quality reps for your legs, say you're on squatting or leg pressing, or whatever you happen to be doing. I know some of you hypertrophy guys will do leg presses. Well, you know how I feel about that. But the point is, you could count it that way, and then that could be another way to look at total training volume, right? Because that volume matters for both stimulation and it matters for recovery. Because when you start looking at stuff like Dr. Mike always talks about, is staying between your minimum effective volume and your maximum recoverable volume. And of course, he points out that the more advanced you get, the closer that number gets. In other words, a noob or a less experienced lifter, a less developed lifter with less musculature, just doesn't need as much volume to stimulate new adaptation. And they might actually have a really large gap between the minimum they have to do to stimulate growth versus the maximum they can recover from. And what he says is that generally you're going to undulate things and try to move towards the most work you can recover from if you're trying to get the most gains. And I mean, that makes sense. That's totally logical. And again, and that's even from a researcher himself. This is, well, from a professor at least. Former professor, now he's a full-time coach. Again, and that makes sense. If you wanted to get as much growth as possible, even if you're only going to get 1 or 2 more percent from doing the extra 30% more volume, you would still do that if your goal was to maximize results. So you would want to be moving towards that maximum recoverable volume. But again, this just gives you another way to track it. And for example, you guys look at what I do. I discussed it yesterday based on this chart. You look at my squats, for example, what I do right now. I ramp up to a heavy single, and then right now I do 2 back off sets of 3 with beltless pause squats. Well, my 3 rep sets on my back offs are probably around my 5 rep max for a pause squat, right? They're probably right there, if not close to my 3 rep max, because they're hard. And even one of my warm up sets is approximately my 5 rep max before my heavy single. So I end up getting 2 singles that fall in this chart and then 2 triples. So for me, that's about 8 actual reps out of my workout that could be stimulating hypertrophy. Now, arguably, we could argue what those percentages really are, and it might only be 7. You draw that out over 6 days a week, though, we're talking about over 40 reps that actually had a hypertrophic effect. Whereas if I just did 5 sets at 10, it would actually be a lot less than that, even if I did that something like twice a week, or it might be close to on par with it. So that's just a different way of looking at it. You could do that for your program. It doesn't have to be just for me and my personal training. I just use what I'm doing on my squats as an example, using that chart to kind of get in the ballpark of where you're at. And that is how you can also track your total weekly volume as well, if you wanted another way to track it. Right? Another way to track it instead of trying to figure out tonnage, because when we start going to really high reps, the tonnage thing goes out the window. You start doing way more tonnage, but we don't see more muscle growth necessarily. In other words, 4 sets of 25 to failure doesn't seem to produce in a lab more muscle growth than 4 sets of 10. They seem to be pretty similar when you start getting into higher reps, even though the latter you're going to have a tremendously larger amount of tonnage. So that's where we start to realize the volume formulas don't work. Whereas in the actual quality of reps, the reps that actually stimulate all the available motor units are probably the ones that are going to matter the most. So I think it's actually just an interesting way to look at it for tracking your volume. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.